Hello and welcome to the Ransomware Landscape, Threats Driving the SEC Rule and Other Regulations. Today's webinar is sponsored by Palo Alto Networks Unit 42 and produced by Actual Tech Media. My name is Scott Becker. I'm from Actual Tech Media and I'm excited to be your moderator for this discussion panel. Now, before we go to today's great content, we do have a few housekeeping items that will help you get the most out of this session. First off, we want this to be an informative event for you, so we encourage any questions in the questions box in your webinar control panel. Not only will we have team members responding to questions during the live event, but we'll also have a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the presentation where we'll discuss in greater detail some of the top questions that you ask. A Q&A panel is also the place to let us know about any technical issues that you might be experiencing. Browser refresh will fix most audio, video, or slide advancement issues, but if that doesn't work, just let us know in the Q&A and we'll provide further technical assistance. Now, second, in the handout section of your webinar control panel, you'll find that we're offering several resources. I'd especially like to call your attention to 7 links in there from Palo Alto. So there's a Unit 42 Assess and Test Your Security Controls link. There's a blog about the SEC rules. There's a white paper. There's a podcast on emerging SEC rules. And there's an opportunity to subscribe to the monthly Unit 42 Threat Intel Bulletin. And then there is an MDR data sheet and an MDR video. So lots of stuff to check out. I encourage you to access those resources now. Maybe open up those tabs so you can pursue them later on. These webcasts sort of end faster than you expect, and then it's like, the handout section is gone. So you want to be able to get those. Now, third, at the end of this webinar event, we'll be awarding a $250 Amazon card to one lucky registrant. Of course, you must be in attendance during the live event to qualify for the prize. Official terms and conditions of today's prize drawing can be found in the handout section as well. Just scroll to the bottom and you'll find the prize terms and conditions link there. Now, finally, one of the best benefits of an event like this is the opportunity to ask a question of our expert presenters. Again, we've got 4 panelists on today, all with different areas of expertise. So to help encourage your questions, we have a special additional prize for you. That's another Amazon gift card, this one for $50 for the best question. So after the event is over, we'll look at all the questions that came in and pick out the very best one and contact that prize winner. So get those questions in early and often. All right, and with that, let's get to today's timely discussion. It's my pleasure to introduce you to our all-star panel of presenters today from Palo Alto's Unit 42. We have Steve Dyson, who's a principal consultant. We have Jacqueline Wodyka, who's an associate consultant, and Sam Kaplan, who's Assistant General Counsel for Public Policy and Government Affairs. And then running the conversation for the panel is David Ferrone, Senior Consulting Director. So welcome, everybody. And David, take it away.
Thank you so much, Scott. I really appreciate it. Just a quick introduction. My name is David Ferrone. I'm a Unit 42 Senior Director, and I drive the Proactive Services consulting practice within Unit 42 in North America. I am pleased to be joined by a distinguished group of panelists today, and I'd like to go ahead and pass the introduction baton over to the team. So I'll start with Jacqueline. If you can introduce yourself, that'd be great.
Absolutely. My name is Jacqueline Wodyka. I'm thrilled to be here today. I'll pass it over to Steve Dyson.
Hi, Steve Dyson. I'm a principal consultant on the Proactive Services team. And like Jacqueline and David said, happy to speak with you all today. Sam?
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Sam Kaplan. I'm the Assistant General Counsel for Public Policy and Government Affairs here at Palo Alto Network, and I'm looking forward to the conversation today. Back to you, David.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Sam. Thanks, Jacqueline. Thanks, Steve. Yeah, so today we have an exciting agenda for you. We're really going to be covering some great topics around not only the ransomware threat landscape, but also talking about some of the impetus around the SEC reporting rules that recently were released. So we're going to go through the current threat landscape. We're going to have some great questions around what extortion groups want and some good commentary there. We're going to discuss our predictions for what's next for extortion. We're going to highlight some of the attack targets. We're going to dive in. Sam and Jacqueline are going to dive into the 2023 SEC reporting rules. And then we're going to round everything out with how Unit 42 can help. So if you have questions throughout the webinar, please post those to the Q&A and we'll get back to them as soon as we can at the end of the session. And I really appreciate the opportunity to present to you. So let's go ahead and move forward. So if you look at kind of our first highlight and theme we wanted to cover today is the threat landscape. Obviously, there's some data on the slide for your edification in terms of how often the threat actors are attacking organizations, private, public sector, et cetera. So my first question goes to Steve. Steve, what does the current ransomware and extortion threat landscape look like from your perspective?
Thanks, David. Every day, Unit 42 threat researchers see information of about 7 new victims posted on the dark web leak site, which equates to about 1 every 4 hours. Shame or leak site posts from the threat actors have increased approximately 4% from 2021, with almost 3,000 victims' information being posted over the course of 2022. The impact of modern ransomware and extortion schemes has also increased, with organizations in approximately 107 different countries being impacted over the course of 2022. However, this information is confined to just organizations that have not paid those criminal groups' original demands, hence them being posted on their shame or leak site. Some organizations pay to keep their information off the dark web, so the actual global impact of the gangs who maintain the leak sites is most likely higher than what we can observe.
Yeah, it's really helpful, Steve, in terms of the context. So as you know, and as you've seen, and as you reported with the data, that the threats continue to materialize and increase. So, in terms of threat actor motivation, what do these extortion groups look to gain?
The 3 main purposes of most extortions are going to start with distraction. So they're using the extortion to mask their true intention for either their intended target within an organization or to distract from other attempts that they're making to either attack the target or gain access to sensitive information or sensitive assets. One of the main drivers, though, is money. They're looking for a way to make more money. All of these gangs treat the extortion, ransomware, any of their attacks like a business. So really their end goal is to make money. Extortion gives them another method to make revenue on top of the typical ransomware attack. Or intellectual property. So they want to find items of value. So they're attempting to extort the organization to really help identify what is of value to that organization, as well as potentially gain access to other items of intellectual property in hopes of either using them as a bargaining chip for further extortion attempts with the original organization, or potentially sell them to a third party.
That's super helpful. And I think we can move to the next slide, content, kind of provide that overview for the audience here. And, you hit on those 3 themes around distraction, money, intellectual property. And it's interesting, right? Because we definitely see a lot more attacks, not only from a monetary perspective, but also from a reputational loss perspective, based off of, the political affiliations, the types of, adversary likelihood targets that those folks have in terms of, hey, we're going to really target these organizations that have this type of political affiliation. So we're seeing more and more of that as well. So in terms of the next slide, if we can talk about your expert opinion and what's next, Steve, in terms of what's next in the extortion landscape.
Yeah, so all 8 items on this slide are pertinent, but really condensing them down into higher risk, high visibility items really come to kind of 2 main drivers. Really, the intent here and the likely trend is going to be continuing to target governments and being more politically motivated. As seen throughout the war in Ukraine, ransomware and extortion are methods of targeting the governments and the country's infrastructure to potentially cripple the country's ability to operate in a normal course of action. So it's going beyond just targeting businesses and working more towards targeting a country's infrastructure. Also, the targeting of global elections by threat actors has shown major movement to political motivation. These are likely to increase steadily with an increase in global conflicts and a movement towards a more digitized election methods. The second one is evolving capabilities. So as with all threat actor capabilities and behaviors, they are learning and innovating. They will continue to develop novel techniques and tooling and likely utilize advances in artificial intelligence and machine learning to create more difficult tactics, techniques, and procedures that are circumventing current security controls.
Yeah, it's super helpful. And it's interesting from a capability perspective when you look at how attackers are enumerating, or in other words, doing research and discovery on their targets without even sending a network packet to their network in terms of what they can discover, just what's on the open source, on the open internet, and then, of course, the dark web as well. So if we move to the next slide, we get into some of the insights around attacker targets. But Steve, I mean, you mentioned some government entities we saw over recent 18 to 12 months that there's been kinetic issues, obviously with gas stations being down, et cetera. So what are your thoughts on some of the attacker targets?
Yeah, so extortion groups, like any threat actor, are going to be opportunistic. So they're going to attack any target that they can find or any target that they can have access to. And that was seen really with the number of 0 days over the last year plus, where opportunistically they'll attack any organization. However, some of the trends that we've identified through 2022 are that the manufacturing sector was the most targeted and successfully attacked industry. This was followed by professional and legal services. We will dig into those a little bit deeper in the next slide. The other thing is the remote workforce is continuing to pose a risk to organizations. For organizations that are not properly securing their remote systems or employees, they're opening themselves up to higher risk of attack and exploitation from those opportunistic groups. And finally, sure, not a surprise to anyone, the United States was home to approximately half or almost half of all the compromised organizations over the course of 2022. Interestingly, Germany and the United Kingdom were tied for second as the most targeted countries. And moving on to the next slide. So like with all things in cybersecurity, ransomware and extortion groups use vulnerabilities to succeed in their attacks. In approximately 3/4 of all the incident response cases worked by Unit 42 in 2022, attack surface exposure contributed to the success for the threat actor. Some other common vulnerabilities, and again, I'm sure that none of these are a surprise to those of you on this call, are out-of-date software. So software applications and operating systems being out of date create a major security risk to any organization, and it just makes the job of the threat actor that much easier. Second, business operations pressure. So not having a good handle on business continuity or the ability to be resilient in the course of an incident or an attack makes it more likely for an organization to be put in a place where the extortion or ransomware attempt might be a little bit easier for them to stomach there. A way to kind of get around this is having good handling of those business operations, especially during disaster occurrence like an incident, can help remove the pressure from the organization and allow easier decision making. And finally, as noted at the beginning, attack surface exposure. So not having an idea of what is externally exposed, so what's exposed to the internet, and not properly managing those external resources just creates a wide open door for the threat actor to get in. So really, again, all of these here are really pertinent items tying back to those trends that we saw and discussed previously.
Very helpful context, Steve. I really appreciate it. If we can move to the next slide. You talked about the manufacturing industry, and it's interesting. If you look at that industry, and I've done a lot of consulting engagements over the last 15 years, helping the manufacturing industry up-level their cybersecurity posture, continuous themes are because if you look at that industry, there's not that type of high regulatory pressure to adhere to either a certain cybersecurity framework or a regulatory policy. With the SEC rule that Jacqueline and Sam are going to be touching on later, you're hopefully going to see them up level their game in this regard. So in terms of the other impacts, what other impacts do you think that all of this has had on the industry in terms of the previous data points you mentioned with business ops, deprecated software, and attack surface misvisibility, if you will?
Yeah, David, thank you. As can be seen in this chart, really no industry has been safe from attack over the course of 2022. Interestingly, as you noted previously, the items there, so the industries like manufacturing up at the top of that chart that have seen the most attacks are, traditionally speaking, the least regulated compared to those towards the bottom. Those at the top are also more heavily dependent on supply chain, which likely contributed to the high number of attacks. So really, seeing generally a lack of specific regulation and an dependence on supply chain increases the likelihood of attack and thus the number of attacks over the course of 2022.
Steve, super helpful. Thank you for that. And really good commentary so far. So got a good sense of the threat landscape in terms of industries impacted, some of the common blind spots we see. So in terms of context switching over to the more of the regulatory landscape, obviously in the wake of the new SEC regulation, let's jump over and touch base with Jacqueline and Sam. So Jacqueline and Sam, how are regulators reacting to this cyber threat picture? Oh, I think you're muted, Jacqueline. Sorry.
I am muted, but I'm back now. So as Steve has shown us, nobody's safe, right? All industries are subject to extortion attacks. And because of this, we're seeing regulators add more and more regulation. I'm going to hand it over to Sam as our in-house counsel who has the dip on all of this.
Yeah, I think across the board, and as we'll dive deeper, both at the SEC, but at regulators really both across the United States, but across the globe for countries that are doing businesses in other countries, we have seen cybersecurity regulation become increasingly more prevalent over the past few years. And in a lot of areas, we've seen regulators that have focused on areas that have been in reaction to high visibility incidents or new threat vectors or vulnerabilities, as Steve sort of outlaid. And this increasing threat picture, whether it's in a particular sector or a particular type or operation of country, is really what a lot of regulators are reacting to when it comes to these new requirements like the SEC rules that have been posed. And before we get into it, I will add just a quick disclaimer that the information we're providing in this deck does not and is not intended to constitute legal advice. All of the information and content are for general information purposes, and to the extent that there are any legal questions, we encourage participants and listeners here today to consult with their own attorneys.
Yes, and we could definitely go ahead and go to the next slide.
Great. So,
go ahead. Sorry, Jacqueline.
A question, David?
No, I was just going to, wanted to see if you could elaborate on the new rules that are being adopted. That'd be wonderful, Jacqueline.
Absolutely. And to kick us off, we thought it'd be wonderful to reference a quote from the new SEC cybersecurity rules. Let's hear it from their own mouth, right? So the SEC observed that cybersecurity risks have increased alongside the digitization of registrants' operation, the growth of remote work, and the ability of criminals to monetize on cybersecurity incidents. So basically, cybersecurity risks, such as ransomware, have become so prevalent that the SEC decided that investors need more information in order to make educated investment decisions. So what does that mean? Well, it means that the SEC now sees cybersecurity posture as carrying enough weight that a reasonably prudent investor should take it into consideration when making an investment decision. That's big, right? It goes beyond just the SEC, as Sam mentioned. We've seen cybersecurity regulation become increasingly more prevalent in the past few years. So to try to simplify all of this, we've separated the more active regulatory areas into 3 buckets. First, cyber incident reporting. Second, cyber risk management. And finally, cybersecurity governance. So let's get into it. Shall we, Sam?
Let's do it. Perfect. I'll start with the SEC. For a brief overview, the SEC can really be bucketed into 2 principal requirements: the cyber incident reporting and the cyber risk management practices. On the incident reporting side, so taking a step back, in July 26th of 2023, the SEC issued their final rule that requires public company registrants, publicly traded companies, to disclose certain information about material cybersecurity incidents on a Form 8K within 4 days of determining that incident is material. While the SEC finalized this rule at the end of July, we've seen an increased focus placed on how, where, and when companies report on these cybersecurity incidents that impact their organization. This final SEC rule is substantially similar to a proposed rule that the SEC posted in March of 2022. With regard to the cyber incident reporting in this final rule, there are some key changes that are worthy of note. So first, the SEC narrowed the scope of information that must be disclosed about a material incident, while still requiring that the disclosure to the SEC can be amended if all the required information is not available at the initial time of the filing. Second, the SEC shifted the timeline. It's still 4 days, but it shifted the timeline for organizations to assess the materiality of a particular incident. While it was originally proposed as soon as reasonably practical, the new finalized rule asks companies and organizations to make this materiality determination without unreasonable delay, adding a little bit of bandwidth for companies to do sort of a full assessment on the materiality of those incidents. Third, the final SEC rule does implement a process where it allows for delays for organizations to disclose that material incident when the Attorney General of the United States notifies the SEC in writing prior to the disclosure deadline that the disclosure to the SEC could pose a substantial risk to national security or public safety. As we understand it, they are implementing and developing a process for the Attorney General to make those determinations. Last, the final rule omits the requirement to disclose a series of immaterial incidents that are material in the aggregate, but it does expand the definition of a cybersecurity incident to include incidences in which a company is materially affected by a series of related unauthorized occurrences. With respect to reporting, the disclosure should primarily focus on the impacts of a material cybersecurity incident rather than the discrete technical details of the incident itself. So these would be where there's a harm to the company's reputation, customer vendor relationships, competitiveness, the possibility of litigation or other regulatory investigations. As part of this materiality determination, the financial condition and result of the operations is not the exclusive test. Companies should really consider qualitative factors alongside those quantitative factors in determining whether the material impact of that incident requires disclosure. Last, this final rule does not exempt registrants from providing disclosures regarding cybersecurity incidents on third-party systems that they use, and it does not provide any type of safe harbor for information disclosed about third-party systems. Last, and with respect to the disclosure itself, it's not requiring details in the reporting to the SEC on the incident's remediation status, whether the incident is ongoing, or whether there were any particular types or data sets compromised. That specific technical information is not required, nor is it about the organization's planned response to the incident, how it's related to other networks or devices, or other potential vulnerabilities. Any of that detail, which could really impede the registrant's response to that incident, is not required in the new reporting requirement at the SEC. We can move to the next slide. As we were laying out at the outset, the SEC requirement also has an aspect with regard to cyber risk management. So the new rule also adds a regulation in the form of Item 106, which requires registrants to describe the processes for assessing, identifying, and managing those material risks from cybersecurity threats, as well as the material effects that are reasonably likely from the cybersecurity threat, and which could include an analysis of previous cybersecurity incidents. This new regulation in Item 106 is also going to require those registrants to describe how the board of directors is exercising oversight of risks from those cybersecurity threats, what management's role and expertise in assessing those material risks from cybersecurity are. And all of this needs to be now reported under this new regulation in an annual Form 10-K, which is part of the public registrant's annual disclosures to the SEC. To put this rule in context with regard to the cyber incident reporting obligation and the cyber risk management, we've seen similar regulations across the globe. In Australia, for example, last year's amendments to the Critical Infrastructure Security Act, or SOCI, implemented requirements that mandated covered entities, which are critical infrastructure operators, to implement a cyber risk management program and a broader risk management program that really needs to include an analysis of all hazards approach, to include cyber, physical threats, natural hazards, personnel, and supply chain risks. Under this Australian reg, organizations are going to be required to report to the government annually on their risk management plans and must attest that there is board level sign off that the RMP is up to date at the end of that particular financial year. Similarly, in the European Union, last year, the EU passed the Network and Information Systems Directive, or NIS2. This was an update of their central cybersecurity regulation. So NIS2 creates an increasing level of responsibility for critical infrastructure operators that requires management bodies of essential and important entities, which covers every critical infrastructure sector that you can imagine across the European Union. It requires those management bodies to ensure that the elements of NIS, the technical elements, are overseen by those management bodies. It specifically directs the member states, which were in this implementation process now, to implement further regulations that are going to further articulate how those management bodies approve cyber risk management measures that are taken by these critical infrastructure operators. It will require them to supervise the implement of the risk management plans and to follow specific and regular training processes to ensure that those management bodies have the required knowledge, skills, and ability to assess those cybersecurity risks. Move to the next slide. So as we've seen in these various incident reporting regulations that have recently passed or in the consultation phase, like we talked in SEC, with regard to incident reporting, the SEC requires a report 4 days from determining that incident is material. In the United States, we've also recently seen the Federal Acquisition Council propose a regulation for federal contractors that is going to require cyber incident reporting 8 hours from the discovery of that incident. In NIS2, there's a cyber incident reporting requirement that requires those critical infrastructure operators to report within 72 hours from discovering the incident. And in India, CERT India issued a directive that requires operators to report 6 hours to CERT India after discovering that the incident. As we can see, policymakers across the globe, across the United States, are developing these regulations with an aim and an eye towards requiring organizations to have a better and more complete visibility across their networks and systems to give them the ability to detect and identify incidents. Concurrently, policymakers are really pushing businesses to have processes, mechanisms, and plans to complete those assessments of the incidents and assess their severity within these very discrete timeframes.
So risk management is not a new concept within this realm, right? Identifying, prioritizing, managing, monitoring risks. You've heard of this all before. So new regulations are focusing on these common principles and taking them a step further by also calling for associated documentation and established executive reporting procedures. As we walk through these bullet points, you'll see how familiar they are. From our perspective, these are a few things that organizations should be doing to be aligned with the regulations Sam just spoke about. So implement continuous risk management to include at least annual assessments. Also, depending on the size of your organization, consider whether these assessments can be conducted by an external party. Having an entity like Unit 42 perform your annual risk assessments will provide your entity with an impartial, holistic review. Additionally, consider maintaining an internal policy or standard that clearly states that your entity will be conducting these assessments on an annual basis, at a minimum, as well as any other details that pertain to your entity's style of managing risk. Next, implement technology to assist with identifying and managing organizational risks. Consider implementing new technology, such as vulnerability scanners, Or if your organization already maintains this type of technology, you're thinking, we got all the tools, we're killing it. Well, we challenge you to consider whether their value is being maximized. Are your tools properly configured to your organization's needs? Is your SIM or EDR solution returning an overwhelming amount of false positives? Are the results being systematically reviewed by a designated team member? Addressing these types of questions is just as important, if not more important, than implementing the technology itself. Finally, establish executive leadership reporting of risk posture and management. Regulators want to know that executive leadership is being kept in the loop of the organization's cybersecurity posture and its associated risks, right? This flow of information allows executives to account for cybersecurity when looking at the organization's overall risk posture. So how do you show this? How do you show that this information is getting to the people it needs to get to? By conducting routine meetings between your security team or a representative thereof and executive level personnel. Set a cadence that must be maintained, must be respected, and have those meetings reoccurring. This does not mean that you need to get into the nitty-gritty of your company's vulnerabilities, but rather focus on what cybersecurity overarching threats are facing your organization and how you're dealing with or managing those risks. Last point here, define processes to align with incident identification and reporting. So, documentation, documentation, documentation. Take what we just spoke about as an example. The process and cadence in which your security team is advising executives should be documented in a formal standard or procedure. Other examples include incident response plans or incident response playbooks. They should provide clear steps detailing incident identification and reporting processes. So the who, the when, the how. These are all main points that we recommend our clients address in this type of documentation. One of the most common things we hear is, well, so-and-so from our team is the best. They're well-trained. They know what to do and when to do it. That's great. We're so happy to hear it. But what if that person happens to be out of the office that day, right? Life happens. You got to make sure that you have documentation available for any team member to be able to follow to the T. So for reference, we've listed a few services that we believe are applicable to this regulatory theme. I know you're dying to learn more about them, but not to worry. Shortly, Steve will be jumping in and explaining how they can help your organization. Sam, you want to kick us off with governance?
Let's talk about governance. So in the second and third major bucket that Jacqueline and I identified, with regard to governance, and just as we've seen with respect to incident reporting requirements, many of these regulatory frameworks and proposals are also requiring companies to develop and implement more holistic cyber risk management and governance plans. For example, and as we discussed earlier, the SEC requirement under the new rule requires reporting on a company's risk management plans and the implementation of those plans in their annual filings. We've seen those similar mandates throughout the EU. For example, in the NIS2 directive, which we talked about earlier, that's going to apply to those critical infrastructure operators. One of the implementing acts under NIS2, which applies specific to the financial sector, the Digital Operational and Resilience Act, also has requirements in it regarding those financial institutions and their cyber risk governance plans. Similarly, in Australia, and as we talked about above, that SOCI Act, the update to the Critical Infrastructure Act, requires those companies to have that comprehensive risk management plan. That includes both physical risks, natural hazards, but discrete requirements with regard to the cyber risk management elements. And under that act, the organizations have to confirm those plans have the awareness of the corporate board.
So this theme, governance, is particularly interesting to us. It's interesting because regulators are no longer relying on an excellent security team. They want to see higher ups, executives, and board of directors be brought into the cybersecurity conversation, right? Be a part of the cybersecurity journey. So let's dive back into a couple of the things we think your organization should be doing. Establish a process for the board of directors' oversight of cyber threats. So this point really focuses on your systematic escalation or reporting procedures. If regulators like the SEC have determined that cybersecurity is important enough that it's requiring public disclosures over the matter, then it's definitely important enough to be brought to the attention of your board of directors. Board of directors should be informed of an organization's cybersecurity posture on a regular basis. Board of directors should be informed on a regular basis. They need to know what's going on. It's really important for these regulations. Next up, maintain a process to brief management and the board of directors of incidents, preferably documented as a policy and or procedure. So what we just spoke about, right? All procedures about how your executives and the board will be looped in, that all needs to be documented. Not only does this provide a guide for team members to follow, but very importantly, it provides an auditable record that says, hey, this is how we do things here. Auditor, this is normal course of business. Nothing to look at over here. Another thing to keep in mind is updating incident playbooks. They should state that management and the board of directors shall be informed in the case of an incident that meets certain criteria. Take the time to meet and map out the SOP for informing the board based on incident criticality and or impact to specific business functions, systems, or data. Also, the organization should work with the board to determine when they would like to be brought in. Have these conversations. Communication is key. Next up, establish management's role in assessing and managing material risks from cyber threats. Okay, so the security team has done its part. It successfully briefed the board of directors and executives on pertinent cyber risks. So what are the next steps, right? Ensure that they have a designated personnel to act on this information. Just receiving it isn't sufficient. Accountability is an essential theme throughout these new regulations. Having designated personnel that is responsible for assessing and managing cybersecurity risks ensures that all these things don't fall through the cracks. This is all about management understanding and being accountable for these risks. Lastly, review projected investments into cybersecurity policies, risk and vulnerability management, and security technology. Take the results from your continuous risk and vulnerability monitoring and create processes to improve the overall cybersecurity of your organization. Identifying a risk is only the first step, right? We need to actually address the findings. It's a continuous process of improvement, and yes, your job is never done. So now that we have all this information, if we can move on to the next slide, and Steve, hopefully you can give us a holistic view of what this means for an organization.
Yeah, thank you, Jacqueline. Any strong defense is going to typically, not surprising, cover people, process, and technology. On the people side, as Jacqueline noted in the previous two slides and Sam referenced across a number of regulations, ensuring that you have proper roles and responsibilities assigned for not only incident response staff, but also risk management staff. These roles and responsibilities are also going to include executive leadership, the board, and other stakeholders outside of traditional information security or information risk to ensure you have that holistic picture and that holistic view of both incident response and risk management. Make sure that you have varied experience. So train up your staff, making sure that people are good at their job and are trained into what to do during an incident or throughout risk management. Including in that training is also going to be internal training and making sure that that internal training, again, addresses the entire organization so that the organization has that view of risk management and the risks posed to the organization. On the process side of things, making sure that you have documented processes and procedures across risk management, incident response, how to report and track risks. And you have processes to escalate that information up to the board to ensure that you're in compliance and they have a view of the overall risk management posture, as well as what's going on with regard to incident management. And finally, with technology, as Jacqueline well noted, just having technology doesn't satisfy this. You got to make sure that the technology has been implemented correctly. I'm sure everyone has heard of junk in, junk out. Make sure that you have proper logging in place and that you have visibility across your entire environment. Making sure that the technology has been set up correctly to tailor it to your existing enterprise. Do what you can to automate here. So implementing a SOAR platform or whatever automation you can within your existing technology to try to ease the burden on the people side. So be a force multiplier with the technology. And then finally, work towards getting that single view. So work towards getting all of your relevant risk and incident or alerting information into a single dashboard, whether that is using a common set of technologies that can work together, or having that centralized view within, say, a SIM platform or another dashboard to increase the overall visibility of the security team and make the relevant information easy to access for anyone. If we could move on to the next slide. Though a major caution here is technology in and of itself does not satisfy these regulations. So as was noted by Sam when discussing all of the different regulations, these regulations require more than just technology. All organizations need coverage across people, process, and technology to adhere with the regulatory requirements. The programs need to have a holistic approach, as noted in the previous slide. If we could move on to the next slide. Okay, so how can Unit 42 help? As Jacqueline noted previously, Unit 42, we do security consulting. So we handle both the GRC side as well as incident response. And if we could move on to the next slide.
That's exactly right, Steve. And one of the things from a overall, consultative perspective, you mentioned people, process, technology, and I love how you articulated that technology not only solves the problem, it's not going to solve all these problems. Sam did a wonderful job laying out, not only what the U.S. is doing, but what other international constituents are doing around, their governance processes, their risk management prowess in terms of what they're expecting from the publicly traded entities and private entities, especially those that are serving as critical infrastructure providers. So we talk about all these different domains in terms of how we can help. So looking at things like incident response, that seems to be an overarching theme in terms of that is not only what kind of how Unit 42 came to fruition in terms of the business itself, but it's the impetus behind a lot of the regulations that came through over the years. Specifically around, getting into the IR plans, Steve, how do you ensure that organizations' incident response plans are ready to deal with the new requirements set forth by the SEC?
Yeah, so with regard to incident response plans, the best thing that can be done is reviewing them with in-house counsel or external counsel and making sure that the required areas within the different regulations are addressed. So making sure that you're in alignment and then make sure that those are being socialized with the appropriate stakeholders. So those that are either participating in the incident response processes themselves throughout the incident response lifecycle, as well as the executive and board teams that are going to be required to make decisions during an incident. And bringing that, cohesive picture across all products and services. The slide here is just some sample services and products from Palo Alto Networks and Unit 42 that are applicable across the three main domains that we discussed. And really highlighting the kind of the four main things that an organization can do, whether from an internal perspective or working with a partner, are really starting with a risk assessment. Yes, these are still important. Yes, they still need to be done every year. Identifying risks and creating corrective plans to help secure an organization. Make sure that you're in compliance with the regulations that we discussed. This is common across all of the regulations, are to have a view of the risks for an organization and a plan of how to manage said risks. Pen testing is also important to help identify risks and potential vulnerabilities. This, along with the cyber risk assessment and tabletops, are typically one of the few things that are called out across regulations. So pen testing is often referenced as a way of helping to identify and manage risks across many of the regulations we've discussed. As David, you noted, a strong incident response plan. So making sure that you have an incident response plan, that all of the relevant stakeholders are aware of said incident response plan, and you're documenting the steps that the organization will take to deal with an incident is also important. This goes beyond just simply a best practice. This is again, commonly a requirement of showing reasonable security for an organization if litigation were to occur, as well as ensuring compliance with many of the regulations we have discussed. And finally, conducting a tabletop exercise. Tabletop exercises are a great way of testing out your incident response plan, training your staff, and making sure that everybody is aware of their own roles and responsibilities. It also helps build muscle memory with the incident response teams, that it won't be a surprise if an incident does occur of what they need to do, how they need to do it, and what the plan calls for. With the view into the SEC regulation, it's important that board members are participating or have their own tabletop exercise. So making sure they're aware of their own responsibility during the incident response lifecycle, questions that they may need to address, and get them in the mindset that during a true incident, you're not always going to have a full picture of everything that's occurring. So start preparing to make decisions with limited information, just like in the real world if a true incident were to occur.
Love those data points. We can move to the next slide. Steve, I wanted to hook on that one. Just you mentioned some really important points around tabletop exercises and pen tests. So a lot of studies have been done. So Unit 42 does a lot of empirical after action reports of, okay, what are some of the things that were potentially deficient in terms of the cybersecurity program capabilities that were not in place post-incident, right? So things like tabletop exercises, adversary simulation, or red team, purple team type exercises may not have been in place. So the tabletop exercise, I emphasize, and I recommend that so much because it's going to really enlighten your technical operation and executive teams on where your blind spots are, but also most important, it's going to give them that proverbial muscle memory so that they know who to call, they know who the roles and responsibilities are for the incident commander. That's another big data point. There's a lot of breaches that happened most recently where that role was not defined anywhere in anybody's in the organization's IR playbooks. So it's a really good kind of cross thread to see what all those people, process, and technology deficiencies there are. So that not only does it raise the situational awareness, it also elicits support from cross-functional teams for additional investment in cybersecurity controls. So with that, in terms of making an action plan, so Unit 42 is one of our major platforms for helping our clients is the Unit 42 retainer, and we actually can position that in multiple tiers based off of the SLAs you would like to have. And then it is packaged with our proactive services that Steve articulated. So that's definitely an option. But then also, if you're already, your retainer situation is not something you want to move forward with now, we could also help in more bespoke exercises for you as well. But most importantly, Unit 42 is here for the community. We provide threat intelligence on a regular basis based off of maybe net new 0 days that come out, any notable threat campaigns. That type of information is obviously published on a recurring basis. And we also have a threat vector podcast that is released on a biweekly basis via the CyberWire podcast. So definitely stay in touch with us, and we look forward to that. But I think it's a perfect time to pivot into Q&A, and there's definitely some questions. And I think this one might be good for Sam. Sam, so looking at the measures for governments to streamline reporting and or regulatory requirements when it comes to these types of cyber provisions, are there any measures in place?
David, that's a great question. As I'm sure the audience can gather, there's really sort of I wouldn't want to call it a patchwork, but just a multitude of requirements that are sort of propagating both within particular jurisdictions like the United States, but also across the globe. I will, much to the US's credit, there are cyber incident reporting requirements that are coming out. We talked about the SEC reporting requirement. CISA is similarly developing regulations with regard to how critical infrastructure operators are going to be required to report incidents under CIRCIA. But the U.S. government actually has a council that was set up. It is a Cyber Incident Reporting Coordination Council that's run out of the Department of Homeland Security. They just published a report back this summer on how various regulatory bodies can look to help coordinate cyber incident response reporting requirements. Within EMEA, we talked about the NIS2 directive. The NIS2 is really designed to serve as sort of the umbrella regulation for cybersecurity across the European Union, with implementing regulations that are designed to both reference back to NIS2, but all sort of serve under that same sort of regulatory framework. So I think countries and jurisdictions are looking to sort of streamline reporting requirements. We've seen similar sort of efforts out of Australia with regard to incident reporting and data breach requirements, to tell you the truth. But I think this type of obligation and these types of burdens on industry is something that regulators are paying attention to. And it's sort of the tail wagging the dog. This is a muscle memory that's sort of developing to keep up with the regulators, but there are sort of efforts to look at ways to sort of better coordinate these reporting requirements across jurisdictions.
Super helpful, Sam. And I like the theme of, the rising tide of regulation, and ends up raising the proverbial boats of cybersecurity programs, because, we're learning from the best of these different governmental entities. So I actually feel like that from an advocacy perspective, it really helps organizations up-level their capabilities. So there's another question here I think this one might be good for Jacqueline. Jacqueline, what strategies or technologies are in place to mitigate cybersecurity risks and reduce the likelihood of having to report incidents to the SEC?
Yeah, absolutely. So really any proactive efforts, right? Anything that'll limit the impact to your organization. I think a lot of the things we spoke about today are really relevant. Those really are the things you want to focus on, right? So you can either leverage a tool that'll identify or block proactively, or engaging a retainer, maintaining a retainer with somebody like Unit 42, so that when it's time to bring in the incident responders, all of that's done, right? Timing really matters with these things, and limiting and mitigating that impact. And finally, processes. I think that's something we really kept circling back to here today. Any processes that'll mitigate that impact, that's going to get to the materiality. The impact, the materiality, that's all what you want to limit. And by containing that, that's really how you'll be able to try to prevent those reportings.
Love that. It's great commentary. And I really like what you said around the readiness, right? When you have a retainer in place where that tribal knowledge, that contextual knowledge is actually already known by your retainer provider, what it does is that it shrinks that mean time to not only detect, but a mean time to contain, which is a key metric, a key performance indicator of a SOC team, to making sure that we all know incidents are going to happen, but the best companies, the most robust and resilient companies, really keep that mean time to detect and contain at a very low level in terms of the time frame. So great commentary there, Jacqueline. I think we have time for one more, and Steve, I'd love your insights here. The question is, what obstacles do you foresee organizations grappling with when publicly disclosing incidents in a form of 8K releases?
Yeah, so a kind of a common theme that I've had with my clients since the new regulation has been put in place is, isn't this going to open me up to more attacks? So by me explaining or detailing my own risk management, what I've identified from a risk management perspective, and details of any incidents that might occur via the 8K, isn't that going to just be more ammunition for a threat actor to target me later and potentially lead to further attack? And I would say, in reality, likely not to be the case. I will say that the depth of that reporting, I think, is going to be a somewhat moving target as, more companies in the SEC in general kind of settle into the new reporting standard. I think that it's definitely not out of the ordinary to have that fear. But I think, as Jacqueline well noted, having that resilient program, having good controls in place across people, process, and technology can limit the actual risk there from a reporting perspective. So still allowing you to comply with that SEC requirement while having a good program in place to deal with any exposure that might occur with that release.
Absolutely. It's a really good data point, Steve, especially around, understanding, the who, what, where, why, and then the how in terms of that reporting cadence is going to be key. And then obviously learning from other entities that have filed 8Ks in terms of the context there is going to be essential. Also, it looks like there's one more that I'll actually take this one. Is the ransomware and extortion threat landscape likely to get better or worse over the next year? And will artificial intelligence play a major role in making the threat worse. So as we've seen, I mean, just from a trend perspective, yes, the ransomware and extortion threat landscape will absolutely get worse. I mean, historically, it's been growing year over year, multi-digit percentages. And because I mean, we're seeing more and more threat groups get very clever with their capabilities on how they're circumventing controls. I did want to focus more on the second part of the question. AI will play a major role and especially inflict pain on organizations that don't adopt AI capabilities in their security operations technologies, i.e., Steve, you mentioned a great technology earlier, SOAR, which stands for Security Orchestration, Automation, and Response. So that technology, if it doesn't have AI built into it, your organization is going to fall behind the 8 ball in terms of being able to stitch together events from various heterogeneous infrastructure elements to discern, hey, this is actually a threat vector, and simultaneously pull in net new threat intelligence from feeds from such as that Unit 42 produces with their atoms. So understanding not only the contextual factors on what's high risk and what assets are deemed as critical in your environment, but also leveraging the power of AI to understand if threats are going to be materializing in your environment. Again, you're shrinking that mean time to contain. Without AI, the organizations will fall behind. With AI, it's going to really help organizations get ahead of those threats to keep those KPIs low, but most importantly, keep the incidents from happening in the first place by leveraging, not only the generative AI, but also precision AI. But because when it comes to these types of issues, precision AI is actually required to making sure that, as I mentioned, the critical assets that are plagued by these threat actor TTPs, that they are protected immediately versus waiting till potential lateral movement and privilege escalation. So with that, I just wanted to say thank you to the awesome panelists here. You all have been so gracious with your time and your responses, and how you've elaborated on the risk landscape, the regulatory landscape. Really, really appreciate it. We are closing out now, so we just want to say thank you to the audience as well for your questions and your interaction. Feel free to reach out to Unit 42 at any time if you need anything, and we'll be sending out the recording and the slides subsequent to this session. So thank you again.
Okay, great discussion there from David, Steve, Jacqueline, and Sam. I learned a lot. I hope all of you did too. This is just a last reminder about those great resources in your handout section. You've still got about a minute to open up those links. All right, well, last but not least, it's time for the Amazon gift card prize drawing. And the winner of the $250 Amazon gift card today is Alan Webster from North Carolina. So congratulations to Alan Webster. We'll be in touch to get you your card. And with that, on behalf of the Actual Tech Media team, I want to thank Palo Alto Networks Unit 42 for making this event possible. And thanks as always for attending and for your great questions. That's going to conclude today's event. Have a fantastic rest of your day.